Good morning and Shabbat Shalom. And I'm Rabbi Ed Feinstein. This is Valley Beth Shalom Torah study for a Shabbos morning. It's Shabbos Thanksgiving. It's Shabbos Hanukkah. It is Shabbos and Shabbos. And it's wonderful to have Rabbi Gellman here this morning. Rabbi Hirsch is spending the Shabbos with her family, so we wish her a very pleasant and quiet holiday weekend. So this morning, Marc, we have many things to talk about. Let's begin with the Torah portion. We've been following the story of Father Jacob. And the Torah portion begins with a promise, Vayeshev. He finally settles down. And you think, okay, now he's going to live a quiet, peaceful, pastoral life, enjoying the wonderful family that he's raised. But no, because now we're going to move into the most developed of all of the brother narratives that Genesis presents. We started with Cain and Abel. We had the sons of Noah. We had Abraham and Lot, his brother's son. We have Isaac and Ishmael. Jacob and Esau was this remarkable 3-episode development we just finished. And you think now, maybe the Jews have figured this out. The Israelites have figured this out, how to live with your brother. And yet now becomes the most interesting, the most deeply developed of all of the brother narratives, the story of Joseph. Joseph is the son of Rachel, who is the favored wife. And the favoritism he carries with him, especially after Rachel dies in childbirth, giving birth to Benjamin, Joseph carries Rachel's specialness into the family, and Jacob adorns him with this special coat. So he literally wears his favorite status on his sleeve in front of his brothers. He's this bratty, obnoxious, infantile, egocentric, the whole universe surrounds me kind of young man. That's the dream. The stars, the moon, the sky, they all came to bow down in front of me. And the brothers just can't stand him. They just can't stand him. And of course, the story goes then that he carries bad reports about the brothers to the father. The father sends him down to the brothers. He ends up meeting the brothers, and the brothers conspire first to kill him and then to sell him. And that launches the next narrative, Joseph in Egypt and all that's going to follow. The whole Torah depends upon that encounter, because that's our connection then to Egypt. Now there's one episode, there's one piece of the story, which I know you've studied carefully, which is so interesting. And the question is, who sold him to Egypt? How did Joseph exactly get to Egypt? So let's go through that. It's a little technical and a little detailed, but it's worth listening to. Rabbi, take us through that.
Okay, so this starts out to be a contradiction in a part of a text that you could say, who cares, really, who cares? But it really is the linchpin to the resolution of the family dynamic in the house of Abraham. And let's see how this goes, because this is another original Gellman vort. No one's figured this out, but I think I figured it out. So here it is. First of all, who bought Joseph? His brothers agreed to sell him. And then Genesis 37, 25 to 28. When Midianite traders passed by, they pulled Joseph up out of the pit. They sold Joseph for 20 pieces of silver to the Ishmaelites who brought Joseph to Egypt. So they sold him to the Ishmaelites. Then we read in Genesis chapter 39:1, Joseph was taken down to Egypt. Potiphar, a courtier of Pharaoh, and his chief steward bought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him there. Okay, so we're still Ishmaelites, even though the Midianites pulled him out of the pit. And they sold Joseph actually to the Ishmaelites. Why that happened is hard to figure. But I have, I think, a solution. But here's the problem. Genesis 37:36. The Midianites and the editors of the Septuagint knew this was a contradiction. So they changed it to the Medanites, which is, there are no Medanites. So the Midianites, meanwhile, sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, the courtier of Pharaoh, his chief steward. Bingo! Genesis 37:36 contradicts Genesis 37 and 39 with the statement, it was the Midianites who sold Joseph to Potiphar. What's going on here? Well, to figure it out, we have to understand the genealogy that goes back to Isaac's half-brother Ishmael. And in the midrash that I created about this, I have Ishmael going down to Egypt to die, to be buried near his mother. And Ishmael awakened before dawn, I imagined. And he did not want death to catch him in his sleep. He wanted death, which was close to him, to take him while he was riding on his chief's camel at the head of a great caravan. And he went down to Egypt. And Ishmael knew that death was close. But Canaan was not his land. And so he left to lead a caravan. And he went down, and the old man asked Nebayot, his eldest son, to prepare his chief's camel for one last journey to Egypt. And he took along Midianite traders to scout the road, and they dealt in slaves, because it was well known that Ishmaelites were not slavers. They didn't sell slaves because, and this fits, Ishmael's mother was a slave. Hagar was a slave. So profiting in slavery was an abomination to him. So here we have the first scene in the Gellman movie. The caravan with Ishmael, who's dying, is going from Gilead down to Egypt, and he camps at a little caravan town of Dothan that's on the road to Egypt, which is exactly where he finds Joseph, and he buys Joseph. So, but here's the problem. He can't buy Joseph because he's not a slaver. So he has the Midianites buy him. But why should he care about Joseph? Because Esau married a woman named Mahalat, who is the daughter of Ishmael. Esau was Ishmael's son-in-law. And through Esau, Ishmael learned about all the fighting in the house of Jacob. And so he knew that this boy had gotten a coat of many colors. And when they pull up this slave to sell to the Midianites, he sees the coat of many colors. And he knows the story from Esau, his son-in-law.
Just wait, let me interrupt you for a minute. So the scene now is remarkable because Esau is Joseph's great uncle.
Yes.
Right? Or rather his uncle. Esau is Jacob's brother, and Jacob is the father. Esau is Joseph's uncle.
Yes.
Paternal uncle, right?
Yep.
Ishmael is his great uncle.
Yes.
Isaac's brother.
Right.
The lost brother of Isaac. All of them children of Abraham.
Yep.
All of them kin, all of them family.
Yep.
So you have the two rejected brothers, Esau and Ishmael, connected to each other by blood and by family and by the certain culture that these are the rejected brothers, right?
Exactly. And let me just say, the brothers, for their part, did not recognize their great uncle Ishmael. This was not strange because Jacob never spoke of him. For had he done so, he would have had to speak of how Esau had married Ishmael's daughter, and then he would have had to explain again how he had stolen the birthright from Esau and the blessing from his brother Esau when he was a young man. You don't want to tell those kind of stories. The failings of fathers are rarely the topic of conversation with their sons. Also, Jacob did not teach his sons about the other parts of the family because the ones chosen rarely spoke about the ones cast out. So Ishmael knew them, but they did not know him. And Ishmael decides to protect Joseph because a good-looking slave boy sold anonymously, on the general slave market into Egypt would have a life expectancy of probably days.
Yeah, fate worse than death, right?
Worse than-
Absolutely a fate worse than death.
Without a doubt. So he takes Joseph into his tent, but he can't admit that he sells Joseph to his main customer, Potiphar, who bought stuff for the house of Pharaoh, but he can't have that well known. So it looked like he set it up so that it looked like the Midianites were selling Joseph, when in fact it was Ishmael who was going down to Egypt, and it is Ishmael who is the agent of the redemption, the salvation of Joseph. And that brings to a circle, a full circle, the fight in the family, and it resolves it. Because now, as Ishmael was cast out with his mother Hagar, now Joseph is cast out by his brothers. And he says, it's enough from this. It's enough from this. One chosen, one cast out. Let me save this boy. Let me save him. And so he did. And he saved Joseph. And on the road to Egypt, Joseph was cold and afraid, I imagine. The brothers had headed the flocks north away from Dothan toward the valley of Hebron. They carried with them the coat of many colors that had the new color of goat's blood soaking into the others. The caravan of Ishmaelites had headed west on the road away from Dothan that went down to Egypt. That night, Ishmael sat with Joseph and told him stories about Egypt, stories he had heard from his mother Hagar. The stories eased Joseph's fear in the night. Ishmael sang songs to Joseph, songs from Egypt, songs he had heard from his mother Hagar. The songs sounded familiar to Joseph, who was soon asleep. That night, Joseph did not dream.
Oh, that's beautiful. I mean, and let's go one more step. So if your great uncle is the one who saves you,
Yep.
so he makes sure that he gets into the house of Potiphar.
Yes.
He plants him into a place where he knows he's going to be taken care of by a wealthy patron, so that he's not just a general slave. You know, he makes sure that he gets into the right place. And he tells Potiphar, because Ishmael was a chieftain. He tells Potiphar, protect my boy.
Yes.
Protect my boy. And that explains why when Joseph is accused of having seduced Mrs. Potiphar, Potiphar doesn't respond the way that you'd expect him to. He doesn't chop off his hands or kill him. He puts him in a posh prison, you know, in this sort of royal prison.
But what's beautiful about this whole complex story is that it is the recreation of the binding of Isaac, except put with Ishmael. This is his test.
Yeah.
Because he is now put at the edge of the pit, and he can let Joseph die because of his anger, and instead he saves him. Just like Esau could have killed Jacob, but they reconciled.
Right.
So here you have Isaac and Ishmael and Jacob and Esau, and now Joseph, who's the one who is just a bridge figure to carry us down to Egypt, so that at the end of the book of Bereshit, we can now begin with the people Israel. But every family dynamic has been resolved. That's the whole beauty of this intricate Shakespearean drama in the house of Jacob.
And the lesson then, because this is Torah, so there's got to be a lesson here, right?
Yes.
The lesson here is that it is possible to grow beyond the resentment of your deprivation and the fact that you were cheated out of the birthright and out of the blessing and out of the position. You can grow beyond the rage and the fratricidal, you know, murderous rage that defines you. And you can find common cause. You can find solidarity. You can find love in a family with brothers.
Bingo.
which is a lesson that the Jewish people still haven't learned.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But don't you see, if this story doesn't exist,
Right.
you've got a million loose ends in Genesis. A million loose ends. What's with Ishmael? What happened to him? And why did they resolve? And what's with the brothers? And they need to tie up all the loose ends. And no one has figured it out, that in the caravan, and I figured out the genealogies, and it was the end of the life of Ishmael. So it could absolutely have been the case that Ishmael was leading the caravan that went by the pit, that bought Joseph and sold him into Egypt, though they had to tell the story two different ways. One, that it was the Midianites who sold him to Potiphar, which is the public story, and the other, the private story, that it was Ishmael who sold his great nephew down into the only place in Egypt where the Jewish people could survive.
And the contrast, though, which is beautiful. The brothers who threw Joseph into the pit are still infected with this fratricidal rage.
Yes.
They're deprived, right? They're the ones who feel like they got the short end of the family stick. They're the ones who felt like they haven't gotten the blessings that were coming to them, and that's why they're trying to kill their brother.
That needs to be resolved, and it is resolved.
Later, it's coming.
Later.
But instead of embracing him, but the contrast with an Ishmael and an Esau, who really did get deprived, who really did get ripped off, and yet these two men have grown beyond their rage, have grown beyond to recognize a familial connection, to recognize a familial solidarity, to recognize that you can't live in that rage your whole life. That's not a way to live your life.
Right.
And there's an Abrahamic sense here of, because you live with a God who embraces us all. And in the end, that's the source of blessing, not the father who forgot to bless you or gave it to your brother. There's an Abrahamic ethic here at the heart of it, which is just beautifully told. It's a beautiful way to tell the story.
Yeah.
So let's turn for a moment, because it would be apropos this weekend. So, the cycles of the Torah portion follow weekly Torah portions. They're not coordinated with the cycles of Jewish holidays. And yet there always are these.
It's almost always around Hanukkah.
Yes, this is the Hanukkah time. This is Hanukkah time. We read the Joseph cycle during Hanukkah. So here we have another set of brothers, and we have another family dynasty, and the Hasmonean dynasty, the family of the Maccabees. The first thing about Hanukkah that I think is very important to recognize is that we tell the story to our children as a simplistic story. It's a story of tyranny and freedom, of an Antiochus who came to steal our faith, and a Maccabee uprising to return it to the liberty of worship, the purity of Israelite worship. We like to talk about a conflict between Hellenism, which would steal our faith, its idolatry, and the purity of Jewish monotheism. But one inch below that simplistic surface, it's a much more complicated story. First of all, Hellenism was a complicated thing because culture is complicated.
I'm a fan of Hellenism.
And we all are.
Judaism would not. Here we're celebrating people who killed a Hellenistic Jew when it was the Hellenistic Jews who taught the rabbis, who created the whole Greek philosophical underpinning of the Talmud, and who enabled us to evolve and develop.
And you have a conflict between factions of the Judeans, of the Jews. This is in the 2nd century BCE, 166 BCE. You have factions of the Jews fighting against each other. Neither side, which is pure, one side which wanted a more radical Hellenization, and the other side which was willing to live with a more moderate Hellenization. But each side finding its way in a larger cultural world as a small cultural minority, finding its balance between integration and distinction, issues that we deal with all the time, because we're very proud to be integrated into American culture. And at the same time, we try so hard to remain distinct in American culture. And we look at other Jewish groups in the world and see how they resolve this. You have ultra-Orthodox Jews who try so hard to reject everything that is modern and hold to what they interpret as a Torah true Judaism. And yet they too participate in the world we live in. And others who have given up Judaism and become completely Hellenized, Americanized, assimilated, Western, and the same issue and the rivalries between them. And now you read the Joseph story and this question of, can we find a way out of these rivalries and find some solidarity with one another? So Marc, what do you do with Hanukkah? How do you make Hanukkah into a serious holiday, or into a holiday that's reflective?
You know, you're asking the wrong guy. Everyone in my shul knew that Rabbi Gellman they called me the Hanukkah Grinch, because I was an anti-Hanukkah, an anti-Hanukkite, I guess you'd have to say. I don't like Hanukkah on every conceivable level. You could not like something. I don't like its materialism and the fact that it's a ripoff of Christianity and of Christmas. It's a poor ripoff of Christmas, but because Christian kids are getting presents, we goosed up the idea of Hanukkah presents and built it on Hanukkah Gelt, which was a Central European minor custom. So I don't like the materialism of the holiday. Secondly, I don't like the people it honors. It honors the Hasmoneans, who became the most corrupt dynasty of priests in the history of Judaism. In fact, they were so corrupt that by the time the Romans conquered Jerusalem and the Hasmoneans were in control of the priesthood, they were so reviled, so hated by the people, that no one went to their aid, and the Romans were able to conquer Jerusalem without firing a single arrow. And they hated the rabbis, the Hasmoneans. They're the ones who turned in the rabbis to the Romans to get tortured and to get killed. And so and the other thing is, the Maccabees are like Ayatollahs to me. They're, you know, they kill people they don't agree with. And then there's the other thing, the miracle of the oil isn't even, it's in an apocryphal work. It isn't even in the Talmud. It's
in the Talmud. It's not in the Apocrypha. It's in the Talmud.
Right. It
comes 300 years after the holiday.
300 years after they invent the story of the oil. Okay.
Right.
Look, it is what it is. And if you look at participation in Jewish holidays, number one, 98.9% Jews give Hanukkah presents. Number two, Passover Seder, and trailing the pack, a distant third and fourth are Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur.
So you really are the Grinch. I'm so sorry. I'm sorry.
I hate this holiday.
All right, let me see if I can fix it. Let me see if I can offer you an ideology. First of all, so the story, as Rabbi Gellman is not wrong. I mean, the story really is a cultural war between two factions of Jews. One faction which sought radical Hellenization, up to and including the placement of an idol in the Holy Temple of Jerusalem. And then another faction, the Maccabees, Hasmonean is the name of the family. They're priests from the countryside, from Modin, who revolted against them and tried to remove that idol. And when that happened, it was considered a political act, because the idol, although it was an idol of Zeus, bore a striking resemblance to the emperor Antiochus. And so Antiochus sends his troops in to protect the idol, to protect his friends in Jerusalem. And that's where the war comes from. That's where the war comes from. So there really is at heart, it's not a war for religious liberty. It's a war between two factions. And the real interesting question is, to what extent can we Jews integrate with the cultures in which we live And to what extent do we Jews remain distinct? And what are the red lines?
That's the great question. That is the great question.
Right. And to what are the red lines? What are the red lines that you can't cross in order to preserve Jewish identity? And I've told you a story. I have a friend, a cousin actually, who is a Chabad Lubavitch Chassid with smicha, who loves to go to Yankee games, right? So he'll put a Yankee cap over his black yarmulke, go to the local very kosher deli and get a bag of corned beef sandwiches and take his son to the Yankee game. And during the seventh inning, he davens a mincha mariv on the lodge deck during the stretch. And I'll say to him, how is this allowed? And he says, what's wrong with it? It's kosher, So here is a person who is, you would look at him and say ultra orthodox, and yet he participates in our culture in certain selective ways, as do we all. And that's the great question of modernity. And it's not just modernity, it's the question of all of Jewish life, those of us who live in a diaspora community, but not even diaspora anymore, because even in Israel, they have to make this determination. How much do we participate in the culture outside, and how much do we try to maintain some distinction, some protection, some insulation from that culture outside? Now, what's amazing, and Rabbi Gellman, of course, is right, over the generations, 100 years of Maccabee rule over Jerusalem, the populace came to hate them because they were cruel, because they were arbitrary and corrupt, and because they were fighting among themselves. Two brothers, Aristobulus and Hyrcanus, have a war between themselves. And when the general Pompey comes to the gates of Jerusalem, the people of Jerusalem open the gates and they welcome Roman rule because it'll bring a little peace, a little quiet to the city. We gave up independence because we couldn't rule ourselves. That's the great tragedy of Hanukkah, which really has resonance, right? And then what happens is, as Roman rule becomes cruel and arbitrary and corrupt, the rabbis recreate the holiday. You find it in Talmud Shabbos. There's no Masechah, there's no section of the Talmud about Hanukkah. It's in the section about Shabbat. And the discussion about Shabbat is about candles. And one of the rabbis says, I have this box of cheap candles. What do I do with them? And the rabbi said, well, you can't use them for Shabbos because they might burn out. And during Shabbos, you might be tempted to relight them, and that would be a violation of Shabbos. So don't use them for Shabbos, use them for Hanukkah candles. And the Talmud stops cold and says, my Hanukkah. What is Hanukkah? And you have this recreation of Hanukkah, and that's where you get the story of the lights. That's where the story of the Maccabees come in. They beat the Greeks. They looked for the oil. They couldn't find it. They only found one small jar, which lay with the high priest's seal on it. But that one small jar lasted 8 nights. And that's what we do for Hanukkah. Now, where did that holiday come from? You were not allowed to tell stories about revolt against the Romans. So what the rabbis did is they created a ruse. What the story is, the world is dark. It's a dark, dark night. It's the winter solstice, and it's the time when we're dark. And that darkness represents the cruelty of the Romans, the idolatry of Roman civilization. And all it takes is one tiny light of Torah, or Torah Ora, the light of Torah, to dispel that darkness. It was their own self-conscious revolt against the Romans. They had tried revolting twice militarily and lost brutally both times, in 70 and then again in 120. So they knew that you weren't going to beat the Romans militarily, but you could beat them spiritually by keeping the light of Torah alive. And that's where you get the lighting of menorah. It's a statement of, it's a metaphor for the faith of Israel in a world that denies that faith broadly. Again, the distinction, the cultural distinction of Jewish life in a world that has very, very different values, which makes it ironic that we've assimilated so much of Christmas into our own holiday. Yes. But here's the question then, and I think it's an interesting question. I love asking this, for example, of my teenagers, the teenage kids I teach. It's like, tell me something in American culture that you dearly wish your little brothers and sisters would not know about or would not get involved in. Help me understand What's in the broader culture that you would like to protect your dear ones who are younger than you from? And the kids are very sensitive. And one kid will say, you know, I like getting presents. All of us like getting presents, but the materialism, the pounding, the message that you have to own this and you have to have this and you have to wear this. I don't want my little brother getting involved in that, my little sister getting involved. So one of the young women will say the sense that every woman has to look a certain way in order to be valuable. I hope my baby sister doesn't have to get that. They're very sensitive about the things in culture that we wish to remain distinct and distant from. And that, I think, is a brilliant thing to talk about at the Hanukkah table. What piece of light in all this darkness are we holding on to that really matters to us, that makes us distinct from the culture outside?
I like that. And I think you're a genius, and I think you may have saved Hanukkah from the Hanukkah Grinch. Those are beautiful interpretations. And because of my love for you, I have struggled to modify my anti-Hanukkah-tarianism. And I have another positive Hanukkah drush. Okay. And that's this. It comes from Josephus, who basically the Roman Jewish historian, who said around the time of the Maccabees, there were something like 20 different religions operating around Jerusalem, and Judaism was not in the top 15. It was very, very, very close to extinction. So if you look at the Maccabean revolt, and you look at the number of people who had left Judaism for Gnosticism, for Zoroastrian, for fourth philosophy, for the Essenes, for all these other different sects and religions, and you realize that Judaism as a distinct religion in 165, before the Common Era, was basically down to one family that saved it. The Maccabees, for all of their right-wing craziness and their Ayatollahness and their intolerance of learning from what the culture of Greece had learned about the world, despite all of that, the Maccabees saved Judaism. And if they hadn't saved Judaism, the Galilean carpenter who came down and formed a religion that 1 out of every 3 people on earth now says is their religion, Christianity, he never would have existed in that way. Or the story of I'm a descendant of the covenant of the Jews, and all of that, there wouldn't have been Christianity. And if there wouldn't have been Christianity, there couldn't have been an Islam to give birth out of Judaism and Christianity. So there wouldn't have been an Islam. So the world as we know it religiously would not exist.
Correct.
If it weren't for truly
one family,
one single family.
Mm-hmm.
And their decision, right or wrong, with all their extremism, to save Judaism and the Jewish people, and they did it. Mm-hmm. And all of the religions that Josephus writes about mm-hmm. are all gone.
Right.
You want to read about Gnosticism, read Hans Jonas's great work on it, and the other works, Schiffman and the others in the that collection on the Apocrypha that they just did, amazing stuff. You can read about all these people and the Essenes and the Dead Sea sects, and they're all gone. They're all gone. But because of the Maccabees, we're still here.
Right.
And I think in the end, I got to cut them some slack and spin the dreidel and say, Happy Hanukkah, my dear friend.
Happy Hanukkah, happy Hanukkah. I want to just add one thing. I've had a drush, and I've written this a couple of places, and I forgot where I found it from, but it's something that attracts me as I think about this. So the story is that the Maccabees come into the temple. They destroy the idol, they rebuild the altar, they cleanse the temple, they want to light the menorah. They only find one jar of oil. Who hid it? Who put that jar of oil there? It wasn't just an accident. Somebody hid a jar of oil in the temple precincts. Now just imagine, okay? Somebody saw the Greeks coming. Somebody saw this radical Hellenization that was stealing Jewish monotheism. Somebody saw this radical move that was trying to destroy what was the essence of Judaism, its monotheism, and give us just simply Greek culture like everybody else, and said, this isn't going to last. Someday the Jews are going to come back and look for their light, look for their culture, look for their insight, their wisdom, their faith. And so they hid a jar of oil, knowing that one day we would come back to light the menorah. Could be a he, could be a she, an attendant to the temple, a priest, a Levite, a cleaning lady, a maintenance man who still had that faith inside and put that jar of oil there and said, I'm leaving this for my children or my grandchildren or their children, because someday they're going to need this. And that image to me is so powerful. And that's what we do in a crazy world. We hide a little light, a little oil, and hope that there's enough for our kids to last as long as they need it for. So I wish everyone a happy Hanukkah. Thank you to the Grinch of Hanukkah. Thank you for giving us back Hanukkah today, Marc. Thanks for your wonderful drasha on the Parsha. And thank you to everybody for listening. Of course, davening from Valley Beth Shalom this morning, and Hanukkah lights on Sunday night. We're going to be doing a communal lighting at 5:30 here on Facebook, YouTube, and on Zoom. Love to have you with us. Great Hanukkah festival next week and here at the shul. And wish you a very, very pleasant Shabbos, happy Thanksgiving weekend, and happy Hanukkah.